In this PowerPoint, we're going to continue talking about CSS, and in particular about keeping your CSS tidy and ways that we can do that, okay? So previously, we have learned about CSS comments before. Just like in HTML, you can add comments in CSS. Okay, but first of all, let's talk about the coding style guide for CSS. So right now, I haven't taught you how to organize your CSS, declarations and CSS rules yet. But I think it's time we start talking about that. It's especially important if you're working with a team on an existing project. The first thing to check is whether the project that you're working on has an existing style guide. So this is like when you become a professional, web designer, and you're working with other people, you're working for a project. Try and figure out, is there a style guide? A style guide is a guidelines that instructs you how to organize your CSS. Okay, so the team style guide should always win over your own personal preferences. There may be ways that you like to organize how you write your CSS. Maybe you like to write all the code for your body first, and then you like writing the code for your header, and then your main, and then your footer. So you like to go top to bottom. Maybe that's your preference, but there might be another way that your team has organized their CSS writing. So you want to follow your team's style guide first over how you want to do it. Okay, it isn't because it's wrong or right. It's just about being consistent. If there's a style guide, follow it. Okay, so everybody is looking at the same thing in the same way. So style guides are important because of consistency. If you're setting the rules for the project, if you're the one that's in charge of the style guide, then the most important thing is to keep things consistent. Use the same naming conventions for classes, okay? Choose only one method for describing color. If you're going to use keywords like misty rose or smoky white, then always use keywords. Or if you're going to use hexadecimal values, then always use the hexadecimal values. Or if you're going to use RGB values, always use RGB values. Don't jump around from one to another. Use the same method all the time. Okay, and maintain consistent formatting. This has to do with the way you indent your code. Let's look at formatting readable CSS. So all the rules onto a single line, like this, okay, or one by one line at a time. I like this because it makes it a lot easier to read. But really, like I said, it depends on the style guide that exists. Okay, make sure that you comment your CSS for sections. Okay, so adding comments to your CSS is going to help any future developer work on your CSS file. Also helps you though when you come back to your project after a break. Let's say you worked on a project and you're done with it, and then a year later you have to come back to the same project and do some updates to it. If you have comments in there, then it's very helpful to remember why you did certain things or what each section is for. Okay, so make sure you add a block of comments between logical sections. So you would have sections in your style sheet, right? You would have things like, okay, this block is for the navigation, this block is for the footer, this block is for the main, this block is for the feature image, okay? So when you add blocks of comments to help section your style sheet, it helps to locate different sections very quickly when you're just scanning through. So you don't have to read every line and scour for that one class. You can say, okay, I'm looking for the navigation, I'm looking for the link in the navigation. So you would just scan the whole sheet and look for the navigation section, and then you just go there and look for the link, right? So if you use a string that won't appear in the code, you can jump from section to section by searching for it, okay? So this is a string here. So if you do that, you can jump. You don't have to scroll. You can jump from section to section. Okay, so make sure that you comment your CSS for notes as well. You don't need to comment every single thing on your CSS, right? Because most of it is explanatory, like body obviously is for the body, right? Footer obviously is for the footer. So only comment on things that you've made a particular decision for a reason. If you made some interesting choices or something that needs to be changed in the future, then make sure you enter a comment there. You may have used a CSS property in a specific way to get around old browser incompatibilities, for example. So then that's where you can explain, this is why I use it that way. Okay. So this is an example here. Background color red. Okay, so I'm using red when I really want to use background image linear gradient. So I'm trying to use a gradient, a red gradient for my background color. But in case, in case some browsers, some older browsers actually don't support this CSS style yet, I'm going to use background color red. And this is a fallback for older browsers that don't support the gradient, which is the second line rule here. Okay, so that's why it's important, because otherwise when you come back to it, you'll be wondering, why did I have background color red when I have the gradient here? Oh, there it is. The explanation is that this is a fallback. This is a just in case, older browsers don't support the gradient, use this. Okay, you can create logical sections in your style sheet. Okay, so the general styles are to have all the common styling first in the style sheet, like the common ones would be body, paragraph, H1, and so on, UL and OL, the table properties, links. So in this section of the style sheet, provide all the default for the type on the site, for the fonts, things like that. Set up a default style for tables and lists. Okay, and you can call it general styles. Okay, notice these two lines. This is what allows you to jump from section to section, if I mentioned before. Okay, so if you're not sure what I'm talking about, put it in your code and see what happens. All right, next is utility classes. Okay, after this section, after the general styles, you can define utility classes. So that should be the next section. So this is a class that removes the default style list that we're going to display. It could be for flex items, which we're going to talk about later, or in some other way. Okay, so maybe you want some lists to have no bullets. This is a class list of no bullets, a list style none, and so on. Okay, so in the previous one, you have determined the styles for the general styles, and this is the utility classes where you have special classes to override the general styles. So here you can add everything that is used side-wide, the basic page layout, the header, the navigation, styling, and so on. And you can also use it for specific things. CSS for specific things are broken down by context page or even component in which they're used. So maybe you have an online store component to your website, and you have a section just for store pages, or maybe you have a section just for registration form or something, and you can name that under this section. Okay. Make sure you avoid overly specific selectors. If you create very specific selectors, you'll find that you need to duplicate chunks of your CSS, and then you have to apply the very same rules to another element, right? For example, you might have something like the below, which applies the rule to a paragraph within a class inside of a box of an article. So then you have article, main, paragraph, box, and this is the border. When you can really just tell that border to apply to box, you don't need to make it so specific. Break large style sheets into multiple smaller ones. If you have many different styles for very distinct parts of the site, and I remember that I told you have just one style sheet for a website, especially for the sites that we're creating in this class, they're not very big. However, if you have a very big website, like maybe you have the FDU website where you have the employee portal, you have the student portal, you have very different sections of the site, and they look quite different from each other, then you might want to have a style sheet split up into multiple smaller ones. Okay, so have a style sheet that includes all the global rules, and then have smaller ones that include the specific rules needed for those different sections. You can link to multiple style sheets from one page. Okay, you can link to more than one style sheet. So rules in the style sheets linked later will overrule the ones linked earlier. Okay, so you have the global one first for all style sheets, for all pages, and then you have a more specific one. Whatever is in the specific one will overwrite whatever's in the earlier one. Okay, so an example I like to give is online store. Okay, so have those things in a different style sheet and put that link to that style sheet only on the store pages. The reason why we want to do this is because then it's easier to keep your CSS organized. Okay, and then multiple people who are working on the CSS, will have a better workflow, right? If they're only working on store pages and they just have to go on the store pages, they don't have to deal with the global style sheet. Next, we're going to look at CSS methodologies. So instead of needing to come up with your own rules for writing CSS, you can use one of the approaches already designed by the community. These methodologies are CSS coding guides that take a very structured approach to writing and organizing CSS. So they tend to result in kind of more verbose, meaning kind of too much for what you might need it for, than if you wrote every selector and rules for that project. So these are the different methodologies. You don't have to use them for this course because we're working on very simple sites. But I just wanted you to know that they're out there and to be aware of them. Okay, so next we're going to look at some CSS tricks. Okay, so one of the first CSS tricks that we'll go back to, I know it's been a while since we've played around CSS, but this is kind of a fun one. You can add a text shadow, to any of your text, really. So if you would like to just go and copy and paste this code into your Saffron website, then you'll see a little drop shadow on your H1. So let's all go to H1 in your Saffron and add this. Okay, of course this will go in the CSS, right? But let's take a look at what this actually means. The first value is the horizontal shadow. The second one is the vertical shadow, so like the horizontal distance from the text, okay, to the left or right, and then the vertical distance to up or down. Okay, and then you have the blur radius, like how much it blurs, and then you have the color. Okay, so it doesn't have to be a black or a gray drop shadow. It can be whatever color you tell it to be, of course, using the hexadecimal value here. Okay, so I would like you to go play around with it in your Saffron site. Okay, the next is the box shadow. Okay, the box shadow, you can, define the border first. Of course, you need to define a border first. And you always go 1 pixel solid. And then you have a padding. Okay, then you have a box shadow. Okay, so you have the first value. And then you have the second value. So first value, second value. And let's play around with that in your Saffron website as well. I would like you to go apply this to one of your containers in Saffron. Okay, so on the home page, you should apply this class to one of the containers. So that can be what's holding your paragraph. You can apply this class to your section that's holding the paragraph or to your main. Okay, and then add that in there. And make sure you submit your changes to CyberDuck. All right. So next, I would like you to make the link have the hover property. Okay. So what this means is that I want you to, those two drop shadows that I just showed you, the box shadow and then the text shadow, I want that to appear only when you have your mouse over a link. So go to the link and apply that in a hover, right? Because only when you hover over it, then you would want that link to have that effect. Okay, so go to your Saffron site and I'd like you to make your links in your navigation have this drop shadow. Okay, and make the divs or make the, make a container in your contact page have a box shadow on hover. So when you hover over your contact list, okay, I want you to have a box shadow over what's containing it. And that would be your class activity, the first one for today's class.